Good afternoon, everyone. We're so happy to have you with us today for the James Weldon Johnson Institute Race and Difference Colloquium. My name is Andra Gillespie. I'm the director of JWJI, and on behalf of the staff and the visiting fellows of the James Weldon Johnson Institute, I'd like to welcome you here today. I'd like to start with Emory's land acknowledgement. Emory University and the James Weldon Johnson Institute acknowledge the Muskogee Creek people who lived, worked, produced knowledge on, and nurtured the land where Emory's Oxford and Atlanta campuses are now located. In 1821, 15 years before Emory's founding, the Muskogee were forced to relinquish this land. We recognize the sustained oppression, land dispossession, and involuntary removals of the Muskogee and Cherokee peoples from Georgia and the Southeast. Emory and JWJI seek to honor the Muskogee Nation and other indigenous caretakers of this land by humbly seeking knowledge of their histories and committing to respectful stewardship of this land. We're really glad that you would come to us on this holiday week and join us for the session. We are honored to have Dr. Deborah Willis, who will be speaking to us about photography in the Civil War era. Dr. Deborah Willis is university professor and chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. She's a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship and a Guggenheim Fellowship. She's the author of The Black Civil War Soldier, A Visual History of Conflict and Citizenship, and Posing Beauty, African-American Images from the 1890s to the present, among others. Dr. Willis's curated exhibitions include Let Your Motto Be Your Resistance, African-American Portraits at the International Center of Photography, Out of Fashion Photography, Framing Beauty at the Henry Art Gallery, and Reframing Beauty, Intimate Moments at Indiana University. In addition, last academic year, Dr. Willis was artist in residence at the Maryland Institute College of Art. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah Willis.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to receive the invitation, Dr. Gillespie, to share my research. It's been a journey, as to say the least, but it's been a wonderful journey to retell the story about photography and the Civil War, Black Civil War soldier, but also memory, personal and public, as viewed through the experience of photography, shaped this history of the Black Civil War soldier. And I'm going to walk through some images today that synthesizes the history, the both difficult and desired history. As today we see memorials about slavery and the Civil War, we're engrossed in debates about monuments, but we also are looking for experiences through family photographs and through public archives and through popular culture, such as movies, when we see Harriet and Belle to Lincoln and Django Unchained. There's something about looking at history that forces me to question the narratives of the past. And I've also been puzzled by the experience of how the imagery of Black people globally have been presented. So I've tried to unravel so many stories, and having this opportunity to research the Civil War soldier and also families of the Civil War soldier, and to read the image. So I want to start off with this cover first image and to think about how do we see this image, where we see a sense of bravery, but we also think about the concept of citizenship in conflict, where on the right, we see a man who is standing in front of the American flag. He sees himself as a citizen. He is standing in front of a backdrop that has cannons and landscape, and he's thinking about his future as we see it, but also the image on the left, the cover of the book. And when I think about this experience of the Civil War soldier, I also wanted to consider today the experience of contemporary photographers and artists who are looking and asking questions about images. And this is an image a friend of mine sent me. It was on social media. It was on Instagram. And it's a projection of Sergeant Nimrod Burke on the Lee Monument in Richmond, Virginia, on February 5th, my birthday, when artists were reclaiming the monument. And so artists Alex Crickey and Dustin Klein projected images of, for Black Lives Matter, of numerous men and women, and to think about that experience, and then to have this projected where someone photographed it and sent to me this image on my birthday and the cover of my book. And I felt that there was an energy here that I needed to share and learn more, because I was unfamiliar. I did not have the name when I researched this photograph of Nimrod Burke. And I found later, as a result of this projection, that Nimrod Burke's great-great-grandson researched him and found out he was born in Prince County, William County, Virginia, that he fought in Ohio, that he was active through the war, through 65, but he was also, they had also a family photograph of Nimrod Burke. And we see this image, which it's really essential as we think about his image. We see the image of that's on the cover of the book. We also see this image that's in their collection. This is a soldier who has his gun to his breast in terms of a gesture of reading bravery. But we also see the US brass button that's on his belt. And as we all know, that the history of researching these images, that when the US brass button was central and essential, and then also his gravesite. And following this history, I also found the experience of Frederick Douglass, who used the 54th Regiment and asking men to volunteer to be a part of this regiment, and how men who joined, some were unable to fight, but they joined early on. And here we see a young man who joins this service, and unfortunately he dies because of poor conditions and health conditions at an early time. So he was only in the war for less than 6 months. But here Frederick Douglass sends this broadside to colored men, 54th Regiment of African descent, to join the service. Carrie Mae Weems is an artist who is constantly looking at the past, constantly looking at images, asking questions. And then this image here, she says, I looked and looked to see what so terrified you. This is in 2006. She's reflecting and on her own beauty, but also creating a fashionable dress of women who dressed in this style, who created clothing in this style for the mistresses of the house, but also wearing a quilt. This is kind of a log cabin quilt pattern that Carrie uses, but using that as she questions the images of Black women and how they're seen in history. This is an image that someone sent to me recently where it's circulating, unsure if it's South Carolina or if it's Georgia or Mississippi. But here we see a landscape. We see a slave owner, as well as we see Black men, women, and children in this 18 group portrait. So we see the style of dress. We see a woman who's central in the back. We see a young girl who's appears to be sweeping the fabric or the ground, leaves off the ground. We see the Black driver. We see other Black figures throughout. But what I found fascinating was this, in this image, is this post that has it looks as if it's a whipping post. It's a tree stump without trees, without leaves, without branches. But how is it used? It used also to divide the image from 3 different types of portraits of family. A young woman the Black woman's holding the bonnet in the back. And finding these images, I wanted to think about how images represent what family life looked like, what family life felt like during the period of 1862. These were known as quarters where Black people lived. They were known as slave quarters, but we see families sitting outside, families standing outside. With artists who, such as image of Deborah Priestley, this is called Strange Fruit. So a number of artists are asking questions about these images. They're asking questions about how do they think about the past? How do we go into the archives? How do we preserve this memory? And Deborah is using the image of the mason jar as we consider this history and how we know from mason jars that our families preserved, treasured foods and jams and jellies. But also as an artist, she's looking at how to preserve this history of abuse, but also the history of beauty and freedom and emancipation. That artists, photographers at the time, Black people went into the photographer's studio, posed in the images, and then some of them wrote letters in exchange with their captains, some of the Black soldiers. So this is a hand-tinted photograph of Richard Etheridge, who sends a letter to his former captain. And he writes about their experience, their exchange, their recollections about the experience of race and working together in the war in 1863. I just found it fascinating to discover a photograph of the person who was his captain, who was Hendrick, but also the handwritten letter of Richard Etheridge. That also with this history, which was a complicated history for me, and so thinking about not only the men who fought at the time, but also thinking about their families after the war. And this is a portrait of Henry Brewster, who was sent, this photograph was sent to the Department of Interior, Bureau of Pensions, as his widow, Susan Brewster, said that she was married to him. She sends a letter describing her husband, where he fought. He lost a sight in one eye, where he was injured, talked about his other medical problems, and she had to prove over and over again that she was married to him. She sent a note saying, "This is my only photograph of him. Please return the photograph." The photograph was never returned. And it's in the archives, it's in the Bureau of Pensions. But what's fascinating to me that she never received the photograph, but she also never received any of his pension. And it's heartbreaking in a sense when we think about she met with a number of lawyers over time. She had to prove her marriage, had to prove their relationship, and all of this is in affidavits in New York as well as in Washington, D.C. Images of women. I wanted to include images of women and the importance of women, such as the washerwomen. And this is an unnamed washerwoman, but this is, Frederick Douglass says, now because of photography, the servant girl can now see a likeness of herself, comparing it to noble ladies of royalty, they can purchase images. But I just reimagined this photograph where this young woman is a washerwoman in the Union Army in Richmond, Virginia, with an American flag printed, pasted, pinned on her dress, and the US brass button also on her dress. And so we see the importance of this image. We can imagine that she took care of, because sometimes washerwomen wrote letters, read letters, helped take care of the soldiers who were wounded, but also washed their clothes to make sure that there were cleanliness in terms of that experience. But here we see this young woman who looks directly into the camera, who's letting us know of her presence in this war. Images, as I mentioned before, in the early image of a soldier who's standing with rifle with a pistol, with the American flag in the backdrop, to an image here of family. A soldier with his children and his wife as they pose, and just to imagine this experience of and I thought it was really important. This is not Martha in this image, but this is a letter that I found that a woman by the name of Martha writes to her husband in 1863 in Missouri. She says, "My dear husband, I've received your last kind letter a few days ago. Was very much pleased to hear from you." And she writes about this experience of Black love. She talks about the abuse that she received from the people that own the family. She talks about her children and the helplessness that she feels. She also says she was invited to a party, and she's also asking, that the other soldiers write to their mothers, or other soldiers who received clothing that they could send to the mother. But she says, "Farewell, my dear husband, from your wife. Write to me, I do not forget, and do not forget me and my children." And so when we see this sense of relationships in the photograph that describes their moment together, and here we see the images, it's gold plated in the image. So we see a sense, the photographer took time with this image. He also embraces the US and enhances the US symbol. He also has around the woman's waist a belt of gold and earrings. So in terms of embellishing this story, but keeping alive the memory of family. This is just in a moment of the 5th US Colored Troops in Ohio, joining and preparing to leave for war. To the experience of 1863, can I go back? Where this experience of a woman by the name of Dolly, who was self-emancipated as we see her. And it says here, this is ran away from the yard corner of Jackson and Broad in Augusta, Georgia, in the 7th April 1863, a woman, Dolly, whose likeness is seen here. This is the first time that I had an opportunity to see a photograph on a, quote, runaway slave ad, which I see as a self-emancipated woman. She's 30 years of age, light complexion, hesitates somewhat when spoken to, and is not a very healthy woman, but rather good looking with a fine set of teeth. Never changed her owner and has been a house servant always. It is thought that she had been enticed off by some white man, being herself a stranger to the city, belonging to a Charleston family. And this is Louis Manicolt. Louis Manicolt here is on the right, his image, but it also kind of encourages a way of reading this as a sense of betrayal that she left this household willingly, but also that there are other historians who are looking at, suggesting that Dolly was his concubine, or suggesting that she was attracted to another white man. But what we've also read recently, that she had been in a relationship with a Union soldier who was a light-skinned Black man. Susie Taylor was also very active. She and her husband worked with the South Carolina troops, and she taught many how to read and write so that they could sign when they received their monthly allotment. And these are some of the photographs of the 10th Army Corps, and these are images in South Carolina. But we begin to see the number of men who joined, who believed in the fight for their freedom. Another image that I found that this is an image that's not of Garland White, but a story in an article by a journalist who describes a depiction of a woman who's looking for her son. Her son was Garland White, who was sold into slavery in the lower South. And when the Black soldiers took over Richmond, Virginia, a number of men and women were standing on the sidelines looking to see the soldiers and celebrate them entering into the city. And she walks up to this young man and says, What is your name, sir? My name is Garland White. What is your mother's name? She asked. Nancy. Where was you born? She says, in Hanover County in this state. Where were you sold from? And he says, from this city. What was the name of the man who bought you? He says, Robert Toombs. Where did he live? In the state of Georgia. Where did you leave him? At Washington. Where did you go then? To Canada. Where do you live now? In Ohio. This is your mother, Garland, whom you are now talking to, who has spent 20 years of grief over her son. So she is also thinking about how a lifetime, meeting her son. He also writes about how he felt of meeting her and the friends from the city. But the experience of finding this narrative in this book that I organized and edited and embraced and wrote about, I found it was really important to think about the importance of memory and the trajectory of this woman, Nancy, who knew and followed her son's life through a 20-year period. So word of mouth, through the experience of slavery, through the experience of the Civil War soldier, and all of this happening, that she was able to follow her son's life. This is an image of a gallery on the battlegrounds, and then images of Civil War soldiers in Port Hudson, Louisiana. Stylized images, and one of the opportunities that we say, men of color, we appeal to you. And I love this. This is Frederick Douglass writing, are free men less brave than slaves? So that he is challenging free men to join the fight for freedom, and challenging them that, you know, are enslaved men braver than you? So we appeal to you. And so wonderful ways of how language is used in this. This is in Port Hudson, standing outside of the troops. Sojourner Truth, with a photograph of her grandson, who was also a Civil War soldier. She places the image of her grandson on her lap. So we begin to think about the experience of her style of dress. She also had images where she talks about the experience of, I sell the shadow to support the substance, her shadow, the photograph, or her body, but also the war. But here we see James Caldwell, the photograph here, and he's in the 54th, and placing the imagined body on her lap, as we can imagine what a grandson would do, and that he was later captured. But here again, when we see family photographs and we see the narrative, we also see this image here of Ammon Lewis, who created a bust of the Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who was part of this monument to Black soldiers, where this young artist created this bust in honor of, after his death. But here we begin to see how important it was to create monuments early on in this time frame. And she created this between 1866 and 1867, before many monuments were created for the 54th. And I'm going to flip through some of these images now. These are images that share moments of what it meant to be photographed. Posing in front of the American flag, posing with Lincoln, to the image of Nicholas Biddle, who was known as the first man wounded in the Great American Rebellion in Baltimore, where he posed and sold photographs when he returned to Pottsville, Pennsylvania. And he also kept the handkerchief that wiped the blood off of his, when he was hit by a rock. But we also see it hit the handkerchief that's part of his uniform, and creating this narrative as he told his story to people in the area. And as he retold the story, he sold photographs, and he lived off of this narrative for a number of years. So we have soldiers and sailors. We had journalists, William Henry Johnson, who was born free, who wrote about the experiences of the war. He could not join the war because Black men in 1861 could not fight, but he was there to witness and to write stories and describe the experience of war. We have men who, like Alexander Heritage Newton and Daniel Lathrop, who served at the same time in the same regiment. And the experience of Newton says, I was born under the regime of slavery. My father was enslaved. I felt it a curse of my bones. So he wrote about this experience and he posed. And then the Colored Orphanage, that's part of the experience of many of the soldiers lived in the Colored Orphanage. Many of their children lived in the Colored Orphanage when the families left for war. And this is in New York. Important to see images of groups who were known, Black people who were known as contrabands, when they left the plantations, when they did not have homes to go to. Here we see this experience of a woman who's pregnant, an older woman who has a bonnet, holding the bonnet, takes the bonnet off her head so that she could be seen in this photograph. I see a nurse, and we see older men and women and children. And it's a way of showing the range of the experience of the life of the people who left the plantation. The nurses in Nashville, Tennessee, at a hospital, and we can see the dirt, the filth, and how Black soldiers lived and died because of unhealthy sanitary conditions. But all together, they're trying their best. We see the clothesline where they're washing clothes. We see this experience of Gordon that circulated at a time that he was known as the Scourge back. We see this image circulating in the States. It also circulated in Scotland, because these are images that told the story of war and the experience of Black people. Here, Gordon enters the war, and there's a photograph of him on the left also in the Harper's Weekly, and then when he became a soldier. So we see different ways of how the Black soldier's story was told, also through the experience of the Confederate troops. And this is a man by the name of Sgt Chandler with Silas Chandler, who's seen as his servant. And he actually took care of Sgt Chandler when he was wounded. And even though he was free to leave the war, he stayed with A.M. Chandler during that time period. So what we see, the sense of size, where the chair is higher, and the sense of proprietary experience of here, this is elevated, the white man is elevated, the Black soldier is below. Images of women who lost family members and husbands during war, but also posing. And I think it was really important to think about how Black men found ways to find their sense of self and identity through bravery, and here creating this sculpture, but also this little puppy on the side. So we see these experiences happening. Moments of posing, women starting schools for children in South Carolina. Harriet Tubman, early image, was just recently discovered with the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History. Colonel Shaw posed in many photographic albums, but there's a photographic album by the Garrison family that was donated to the National Museum of African American History. So we see how albums were central, creating these stories from soldiers to the drummer boys, to images of men such as Sergeant Carney holding the flag. Frederick Douglass's son, Charles Douglass, posing in the studio to an image of Lewis Douglass, and the experience of Lewis Douglass and writing letters to his fiancée about what it meant about their love. And this, what I found so fascinating for me is how do we visualize and frame the experience of wives and loved ones, and was important for women to consider the loss of the possibility of a future of freedom. And Amelia was free, lived in upstate New York, but also had the opportunity to be engaged to this young Lewis. He writes her, he tells her about the experience of Fort Wagner, how many people killed and wounded. And she writes back in terms of not to worry. He's telling her not to worry, but she also sends photographs. So this exchange of beauty and love are central to my story here. And then also Charlotte Fortin, her diary. I read her diary over the years, and then I found the ways that she told stories about the Praise House, the experience of meeting Colonel Shaw, the experience of taking him to a praise house to listen to spirituals. And she writes about meeting him. She says, there's something girlish about him, yet I never saw anyone more manly. And here, thinking about that experience of what it meant to meet Colonel Shaw, she writes about her teaching in this community. She writes about the weather. She writes about wearing pants and the different experiences. To portrait of Christian Fleetwood, who talks about creating a diary. Now, this is a time when they said that Black people couldn't read or write, but he writes about what it meant when he was issued his kepi, the bugle, brass bugle, the fourth, his uniform, his trousers, his 2 pairs of drawers, his stockings, his shirts, his knapsack, his canteen. He said there's no way that he could not believe that he was a soldier because he received all of this. And he says, he writes in June 15th, 1864, up at the break of dawn. He talks about the weather, if it's warm, if it's wet, if they're going to meet President Lincoln. So we see these diary pages and we see this experience. And also the Black soldiers. And it's the first time that I had an opportunity to learn about the life of the Black soldiers who were also surgeons, and the range and the experience that they fought to become soldiers, and how they had to study in Canada, and to use the experience of this is John Rapier, who writes to his uncle about what it meant to work at the Freedmen's Hospital and what he was paid at the time. And he's studying in Canada, but he writes about meeting Frederick Douglass and what it meant to meet Frederick Douglass, to the point where Alexander Augusta wrote to not to Frederick Douglass, but to Abraham Lincoln, asking to join, to fight, but also to take care of the wounded soldiers, and how the letter had to be passed down to different people to get an opportunity to take care of the wounded soldiers. So when I think about this, the range of as I mentioned, with Sojourner Truth, to women who are washerwomen, to women who maintained plantations after the Hopkins plantation in South Carolina on Edisto Island. But here they're posing for the photographer Henry Moore. We see some soldiers, some Black men wearing the Union Army hat and jacket, but also we see women and children, sweet potato planting, but we see the basket. So when we think about the history of enslavement and the Middle Passage and the things that were the objects and the memory of how to keep the memory of Africa and homeland, we see it in the head wraps, we see it in the dress, and we see it in the basketry. Carrie Mae Weems also created a response to this image. And here we see this image where she could feel the blood and the scratching of this history and the memory of this difficult history. Aunt Betsy's cabin, Aiken, South Carolina. We see a young girl holding a book. We see women who were washerwomen. And then also images of white lieutenants who created albums with photographs of some of the soldiers. And here, he describes one, Rederick Allen, as an excellent example of a soldier. He commands and he's obedient. We see one who is a light-skinned man and they talk about his light complexion. But we also know that because so many soldiers, when they left the war, that some were still seen as property. And one master slave owner wrote to a regiment to say that my slave Calvin, a light mulatto, left, and I saw him in Lafayette Square in Louisiana, and he's my property. I own him. You need to send him back. So we see these multiple and difficult experiences that some of the soldiers experience. And here's James Roberts, who's now the company drummer, which I found just fascinating because they said he's now stubborn and reckless. We see that he is open jacket, legs not crossed, but his head is tilted to the side. So we see different ways of how identity is formed through this experience. Range of images to the point when soldiers, when they left the war, and they wanted to also, some people didn't have homes to go to. So they joined the Ohio Soldiers and Sailors Home, and they had to fill out a record of their achievements, their enlistment, different aspects of questions that they had to respond to. And if they were injured, all of this was part of this narrative. But also celebrating the war, President Lincoln's inauguration, the second, and Black soldiers were part of that experience. Marriage certificates to soldiers during the war. Here we see one, we see a couple, we also see women who were nurses and spies and cooks and laundrywomen. And W.B. Du Bois organized the Paris Exposition of 1900 and organized an exhibition in Paris. And he celebrated the Medal of Honor winners of the men and women, specifically of the men. There were women in the exhibition, in other parts of the exhibition, but this is the Medal of Honor. And he posted these images on display. Emancipation Day celebration in Virginia, celebrating the war, celebrating after the war and freedom. But again, as we think about the memory of the war, we see the art of the 54th troops in the photograph in the background of the family, and the Black family who showing their family members how to read and write, and showing them family albums, and just creating a sense of hope for a life together. Contemporary artists are looking at the memory of the archive, such as Wendell White, and he created this piece, as I mentioned, once the Black man get upon his person, the brass letters US, let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. And there is no power on the earth or under the earth which can deny that he's earned the right of citizenship in the United States, quoting Frederick Douglass and creating this piece from the archive. Members of Black families walking with their grandfathers, young girls during the war. And to this reproduction, this is the reproduction that circulated. And I showed you with the other image of the family members, which is in the George Eastman House. But here we see the soldiers. We see that Carrie Mae Weems is also looking at that monument and creating another response to the monument in red, the blood, as she uses as a metaphor of the death. And she says, restless after the longest winter, you marched and marched and marched. And she's using these images. We see Richard Benson also use this image to make a print about the 1973 from the monument. To images, as we see here, of the Hermitage in Savannah, Georgia, where some children lived, to images that circulated with a lecture from Frederick Douglass and about the experience of enslavement, to Willie Earl Williams photographing monuments and battlegrounds, but he photographed this monument in Norfolk, Virginia, the money of a Black soldier of Sergeant Carney that we showed earlier with flag. And this is the money raised by Black people in that community. To Linda Ford Roberts, who lives in North Carolina, it's looking at the burial grounds, between Blacks and whites during that period and the separation. And so I want to end with 2 images that I created in response to a Civil War image, and creating a photograph that of the experience of just what it meant to see families and choreographers dancing in front of the images, of a sense of freedom and a sense of what it meant to experience these moments. And I'd like to end here and stop sharing and open up for questions. You're muted. Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation and fascinating. I do want to open up the questions to the audience. So if you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will be happy to read your question to Dr. Willis. I will start off while we're waiting for people to submit questions. I'll start off with a couple of my own. One of the things that I think is really fascinating about your work is that I think a lot of us who are familiar with seeing talks by history professors or who are historians, are very used to seeing kind of like the written and the archival record. Can you tell us a little bit about your method of pairing the archival and the photographic record together?
Yeah, it was really important for me to consider the multiple stories that we experience in researching. I, as a photographer and curator, is always looking for the visual experience to enhance moments of my research. And for working on this book, I had spent months in the National Archives, and as well as with the Library of Congress. And having the opportunity as a curator at the Schomburg Center back in the 80s and 90s, I started noticing that families had photographs of their Black Civil War soldiers. And at the time when I was a student, no one talked about Black Civil War soldiers. No one talked about their bravery, their presence, their contributions. And I felt it was really important for me to think about this today in the 2000s. And today, as I meet students, they had the same experience. They continue to have the same experience. And they felt really unprepared when they learned that Black people fought for their own freedom. And having the opportunity to show not only the written document, but the personal letters, as well as the photographs, to me, it enhanced the story for me. And it kind of incorporated and put together a story that we can see that embraced not only the historian, but also the memory of family members, but also the experience of photographers. Some were for and some were against the war, but they also were there to document that experience.
Thank you. Also, you mentioned that you, did a lot of your work at the Library of Congress and the National Archives. My understanding is that you also did some of your work here at Emory. Can you tell us about which images you were able to find here?
Yes, I found images in the collection, and it was great to find the image of a soldier who left the plantation in Virginia. Enjoying, and his collection is and my mind is like trying to find the name in my mind right quickly, but it'll come back later. But it was to work in the library here was fascinating. Before COVID, I had the distinct opportunity to touch the boxes and go through the boxes and try to create a unique experience, because I wanted to have the South represented. I had to, I was looking for images because of Going with the Wind and in Atlanta, and the experience of Going with the Wind and how people believed the narrative. As I said, that the South won the narrative, but the but the North lost. They won the narrative of the war, that they won the war, but they really did not. But because of that narrative, because of Gone with the Wind, I thought it was really important to try to find images. I visited the Cyclorama in Atlanta, the History Center in Atlanta. So it was really fantastic for me. And also the AUC Center.
Mhm.
So I visited all the repositories there so that I could use images from the collections.
Thank you for that. And I know that there are a number of people who are on the call from the Rose Library, so I'm sure that they are sending you greetings. So I have two questions from Isabel Altamirano. I'll do them in succession, let you handle them one at a time. One kind of relates to sort of the previous question about databases. And Isabel asks, since the photographs seemed to be in various archives, is there any way to get them in a national database? I guess one kind of searchable portal.
Don't know, but I know that since COVID, I have had an opportunity to find a number of images that have been added to the archive. And Carla, who is the Librarian of Congress, was really happy to know that I had an opportunity to continue the research and add to the experience in the research experience in the collection by adding names and adding aspects of it. But I also visited the state archives in Massachusetts and online. And so there are photographs there as well. But finding photographs in the smaller towns and cities where Black people fought was essential. I wanted to find Black photographers, such as the work of J.P. Ball and his work in Cincinnati. So I found it really important to find different archives in different places to use as a way to incorporate the research that was online and to incorporate the local narrative of the war.
Thank you. Isabel's second question is, during the lockdown, I transcribed the enlistment records of African-American Civil War soldiers from Louisiana.
Oh, wow.
Is there any way for some of the soldiers' photographs to be uploaded to their enlistment records? The enlistment records will be released in a database by the African-American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C. And there's a link here, and I'll just make a copy of it and make sure that we get that to you.
Okay, great.
Any reaction or?
I would love to, from my book, is that the question? I would love to share the photographs here in my backdrop. I'm using as my wallpaper of these photographs. They're in public archives. There's some in private collections that I can't, of course, but I could share the name. It's Mirror of Race. The Greg French is the collector, and he has an amazing number of images of Black Civil War soldiers. And so if you have a chance to look at the Mirror of Race, also the image of the gold trimmed with the wife, the married couple. I wanted to incorporate couples in my research, and I wrote to him and asked if he had images, and he shared 3 married couples photographs that were part of his collection. It was, to me, I just found it essential because wives' stories really mattered, because they were left on plantations, some of them, and some of them were beaten because their husband left. Some of them were raped, and they're brutalized, and they describe the brutal experiences that they had, that they endured because their husband left. And these stories aren't popularly or aren't known, but I would love to share the images from my collection to that site.
Great, thank you. So this question is from Jim Roark, who's Professor Emeritus of History here at Emory. You've shown how the photographic record and the written and archival record enhance one another, but are the two ever contradictory? Does one sometimes correct the other?
Yeah, the contradictory is contradiction and complexity is really was central to me in terms of the narrative of some of the photographs. And we know the sense of bravery and what it meant for men to stand in front of a camera, but we also know the fear that they experience. I love the image where Roberts is now reckless and the company drummer. So we know through that 27 images in that photo album, there's one man who's unbuttoned and annoyed. He has his hat tilted to the side. So we don't see the sense of citizenship where he sees that he's denied all of this. We know that some men were not paid properly. There were mothers who wrote letters to Frederick Douglass, but also to Abraham Lincoln and to others to say that I'm sending my son, I expect you to take care of him and pay him properly. I mean, mothers, I love Black mothers, their voices are preserved in these books. And some people ask, well, why don't we know about this? And I said, they're in the oral histories from the 19 WPA oral histories. Their narratives are there. There are selections that historians had, their stories that they wanted to tell, and some were overlooked. And my interest was to create a visual story that was both contradictory and complementary. But I wanted to show the complexity of the experience that, these women the women who were spies, the experience that they had, they knew that they had to send notes to give navigations of where some of the Union soldiers could protect themselves from the Confederate soldiers. But how did they slip through the lines? It was through passing food and that experience. So there were images that did not tell that story, but told the story of, a dutiful maid, or a dutiful cook. So that kind of experience.
Thank you. Gina DuVernay asks, is there a future digital exhibition in the works?
Thank you, Gina. Okay, that's my fourth question with that. So I have to do an exhibition. I was just yesterday, someone asked me the question, would you like to do an exhibition? Can we plan an exhibition? So now that I have my fourth request for that, I now need to take time to do that. And yes, it will happen sometime next year. I'm determined to create an exhibition. I also have been thinking about, fashion a lot. And I'm loving to see how clothing and how fashion designers are making clothes. So I made some scarves. I made a scarf of these images. And there are, as the guys say, they're bandanas. They made bandanas as they're tying them as silk bandanas to wear. And as women, I'm wearing it as a scarf. And so I'm hoping to have those out next month, because I wanted to, these images need to be worn and shared and preserved. And I want to create an aspect of how do we self-fashion in Black bodies and celebrate these people in the 21st century.
Thanks. Isabel Altamirano asks, were the soldiers given a free copy of their photographs? It was so expensive to take pictures in those days.
Many of the soldiers paid for their photographs. And so you can imagine some of them made $13 a month, but they spent part of that money paying for their photographs. It's sad stories I found that some men died holding family photographs. in their hands. Some of them had them in their pockets. Some of them were not encased as some of these images here. Some of them were tintypes, and they were just placed in paper sleeves or paper envelopes and paper frames, and they were found in their bodies, on their bodies. And so we can imagine that what men were thinking about when they died on the fields, on the battlefields, on the battlegrounds.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, how much would a photograph or a tintype have cost?
They range from 60 cents to $2.50.
Wow. Tracy Testin asks, could you share the greatest revelation you had while working on this book? Thank you for your contribution.
I think the greatest one that brought tears to my eyes was Garland White, his mother. It's a long article, and I really wanted to incorporate that her narrative, that question, and the way that she questioned him without saying who she was at the time, but because every time Black soldiers entered Richmond, she looked for her son. That to me was revelatory. There was this woman had hope. And I think that is something that the Black story does not talk about hope as often. And the aspect of Black love is not talked about often. And so those two moments for me of talking about Black love, not through the romantic aspect of it, but also through family love, because it has been denied in these books that we have in our histories, that the language of Black bodies and the talk about Black love is rarely viewed as something important or something significant. So having that opportunity to look at the presence of and the sacrifices that Black people experience, but also the love that they experience as well. I love the exchange between Amelia and Lewis Douglas, where he is telling her not to worry about him. She's saying, she's asking also about the men who lived in her town and how they survived. And they were eventually married after he'd left the war, but he was also injured in the war. So, I'm the ultimate romantic for history, but also for, just the whole aspect of Black love.
Sure, thank you. So the next question is from Sherry MacKinnon, one of our fellows. Thank you for your talk and this amazing work. I'm curious about your plans for future projects and any thoughts you have on similar projects with Black soldiers in other wars, like Vietnam, the Gulf War, or the war in Afghanistan. I'm thinking specifically of my dad who served, but had such a bad experience as a Black man. But I'm very curious about his time in the service since he refuses to talk about it.
Yeah, it's World War II had the two kind of extremes for vets and also men during the time. I always think about, my father was in World War II, and he had great photographs of his experience with his buddies. I know that Gordon Parks photographed the Tuskegee Airmen in this country, but he was not allowed to travel to go to war with them when he photographed for the OWI. I have not considered working on projects of Gulf War or Afghanistan, but I work with projects on Vietnam and World War II, and also World War I photographs and different aspects of it. But thinking about reading what's happening with PTSD and the experience of men and women now, it's really something to think about looking at as a possible project. But one of the projects I'm working on now is, well, like I'm like working on 5 at the same time, is the photography's impact on the Black arts movement. I want to talk about photography. We always talk about the Black arts movement. We're talking about the plastic arts as well as painting and different aspects, but never photography. So I'm working with that on that with Philip Brookman, and thinking of it's going to be at the National Gallery of Art. I also am working on a project on women and migrations, and working with Ellen Toscano here at NYU, and want to create narratives about, and Cheryl Finley, who's over at Spelman, but to create narratives about the experience of women, and why do they migrate, you know, some for love, some for work, some for survival. And having that narrative. We worked on a book a few years ago, and now we have another book coming out, hopefully, if the publisher agrees, because one of the other struggles that we often have as Black writers is getting publishers interested to, you know, to question, is there a market? Will somebody buy the book? Or can you guarantee that 500 books will be sold prior to us publishing it? I mean, I hear these crazy expectations. And then when this book was published, The Black Civil War Soldier, it sold out the first printing. So I'm not sure what the number was, but it had to be low. But then it was, again, it was, you know, reproduced again. But I noticed that happens a lot with publishers not believing in the voices of Black authors. And you know, just today I received one, you know, can we sell these books? So they're some of the projects that I'm working on.
Beatrice Sublet asks, you mentioned your interest in fashion. Quilting is such a beautiful way of celebrating history. Do you think that a quilt with some of the photographs would be a worthy way to honor these heroes?
Oh yes, I quilt. I'm in a show now on Black portraits that's in the LA County Museum of Art. My first quilt I made was after my father's death with my mother, and it's called Daddy's Ties. So we gave my father ties for every celebration, every man celebration through our lifetime. So he kept all of his ties, and he wore them way past their due date. So we decided to, I decided let's make a quilt. My mom was really helpful and kind of giving the history of some of them. Then I used the photographs. I put photographs on fabric and used the photographs of him in his uniform with him holding a rifle. And so these are ways to, but thanks for, again, to thinking about, I'm so busy thinking about the work. And as an artist, I'm trying to continue to make images and make images matter in fashion. And so with this, I'm, you know, making I'm making a kimono because I want the comfort of these bodies around me. I'm hoping that somebody will be interested in wearing them. I'm working with a designer here down in Soho, and I'll send it to you. It's, when we finish, we hope we'll have it finished by December 9th. I think we're going to launch like a t-shirt, you know, and a scarf about these incredible soldiers.
Great, thank you. I just want to check to see if there are any more questions. I'm seeing lots of things coming in, so people are really, really inspired and grateful for your talk today.
Well, thank you.
I'll wait another minute just to see if we have.
I want to say thank you for the invitation. I am so honored to be, you know, Emory is special for me. I just met a student who graduated from Emory while I was in Florida last week, and has her first position at the Norton Museum of Art as a curator, assistant curator.
Wow.
So I told her I was giving this talk today, and she was really excited about it. And so just to see the experience of Emory and having my respect for the archive there, and just to say thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's our honor to host you today. So we know that not much is between us and the Thanksgiving holiday. So we hope that you have a good holiday. I hope it's restful. When we come back for this semester, we're going to wrap up our fall colloquium series with a talk from Dr. Nicole Alexander Floyd from Rutgers University. So we hope to see you here this time on Monday. Again, we want to thank Dr. Willis for this talk. I know you can't hear the applause, but I know that there are people who are making it from their screens. And we just want to thank everybody for being here today. So we hope that you have a good week. Take care.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.